On the 6th of June 1944, Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, starting the liberation of Europe in the famous D-Day. But what if I told you this wasn't the first time that Allied soldiers had landed in northern France in an attempt to retake Europe? In early 1940, the Nazis steamrolled through Western Germany, and by 1941 there were no countries left in Western Europe that were either neutral or had been occupied by the Nazis, apart from the United Kingdom. And unlike in the First World War, their French allies had fallen to the advances of the Germans, and so they were the only ones left. And as the Germans pushed further eastwards into the Soviet Union and were winning that war, they had to prove to the rest of the world, to the Americans who they hoped to sway and bring into the war, as well as the rest of the Commonwealth and the resistance movements throughout Europe, that they still had what it took to win the war and beat the Germans back. The first test came in July of 1940 and through to October, when the Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. This they were successful in doing, but afterwards the RAF pilots failed to find many German targets who preferred to fly further inland over the European continent, and so they were requesting that the army do an amphibious landing to try and capture part of northern France and therefore force the German Air Force back into combat so that they would be effective. They decided that holding a place on the European coastline of the so-called Fortress Europe that Hitler had created with his German troops would be a great morale-boosting experience and could prove very useful for when they did decide to re-invade Europe. And as such, they decided that Dieppe on the northern coast of France was an excellent place to attack. Now, as well as this, at this time they were getting an earful from the Canadian government, who felt that their troops hadn't been sent to see enough combat yet. They were obviously a large part of the Commonwealth, and they wanted the British War Cabinet to include them. So it was decided that in these amphibious landings, they would use Canadian troops to spearhead the attack. So it was that on the 18th of August 1942, a detachment of almost 10,000 men, mostly composed of the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division, as well as several units of British commandos and a troop of about 50 American Rangers, set sail and came to the coast of Dieppe at around 4 a.m. in the morning of the 19th of August. Now, the first attack was in a place known as Yellow Beach, and this was carried out by No. 3 Commando. And during this attack, they actually, while they were coming into the coast with their landing craft, they were detected by a German Schnellboot, which means a fast boat. I think in English they even refer to these boats as E-boats. And in the ensuing firefight, they were able to knock out several of these craft, and because of this, the German defenders on the coastline saw what was going on, saw the gunfire, and they were then alerted that something was happening, which made the job of the commandos even harder. Now, they advanced up the beach, but obviously the element of surprise had been lost, and they were actually able to hold off the defenders for some while with their small arms fire, and the battery on top of the hill, the Goebbels battery as it was known, actually didn't manage to kill any of the ships. They weren't able to hit any of the ships. So it seems that this did work in one sense, but then in the other sense they failed to capture their objective because really the element of surprise had been lost because they'd run into this boat. So the attack on Yellow Beach failed. Just to the west of where the attack on Yellow Beach had failed, there was another mounting that was attempted at Blue Beach, and this was done by the Royal Regiment of Canada. Now, because of the firefight with the landing craft of Yellow Beach and the German Schnellboot, which happened to be patrolling with a tanker, the defenders at this beach near Puy were also alerted to the attack that was oncoming, and so the element of surprise had also been lost. Now, to make matters worse, they had actually planned to plant a smoke screen on the ground so that their infantry would be able to attack without being detected, and it would be much harder for the defenders to actually accurately aim and fire at them as they were coming up the beach. However, because they were delayed by 20 minutes, the smokescreen had already lifted when they were landed, and so they were completely open and bare, and the defenders were expecting them to come up and attack this beach. Now, to make matters even worse, there was a seawall, and you can clearly see in this image where the German bunkers were and where the seawall was. There was absolutely no cover, and it was enfilade fire from the side onto the Canadian infantry trying to get up. Now, there were over 200 men killed, and around 250 men were captured of this regiment of about 556 men, so it was completely annihilated, in other words. And this next attack on Blue Beach, so another one to the east of Dieppe, was again defeated. 6 miles to the west of Dieppe, there was another landing that was staged, and this was actually to try and disable the battery named after Rudolf Hess, the Hess battery, and this was commanded by Lord Lovat, Simon Fraser. And an interesting fact about him is actually that one of his great-great-great-grandfathers was executed in 1747 for having supported the Jacobites. So while he was Lord Fraser, he was only Lord Fraser de facto rather than de jure, because he had been disinherited through an act of attainder. So a fun little link to some of the Jacobite history there. But back to 1942. Now this was done as well with the 50 United States Army Rangers and the British Commandos. Simon Fraser was a famous commando from the Second World War and participated in many interesting raids. And this actually was one of the only successes of this mission of Operation Jubilee, as they were able to climb up the mountainside where these artillery batteries were and to disable them, and most of these men were able to safely return back to England after the destruction of this battery, which then allowed other landing craft to land further towards Dieppe, although these didn't meet with as much success as the landings at Orange Beach, with Lord Lovat, who was awarded a Distinguished Service Award, as well as one of his men earning the Victoria Cross for their actions. The next landing would be done on Green Beach, and this was actually to go up and to again capture the fortified positions next to Dieppe so that they could then go on to capture the town, and this was done by the South Saskatchewan Rangers of the Canadian Army. The problem was, however, that they had actually been landed in the wrong place, on the other side of the River Ski, which they had to cross to get over. However, they had to go over a bridge to then cross into the village of Pourville and then secure the heights above Dieppe. However, the Germans knew they were coming, and they had positioned machine gunners on the side of the bridge, so they had to fight to get over this bridge, during which time many of the Canadian soldiers were killed by the Germans, because obviously it's very hard to capture a bridge, so this ultimately failed as well. Despite the largely failed landings surrounding Dieppe, the main landings of the mission of the Operation Jubilee were meant to occur on the beaches known as White Beach and Red Beach, which were directly in front of the town and would be key to taking the town. And these were meant to be supported, these infantry landings, by artillery, by Churchill tanks. However, these tanks came late, and when they did arrive, actually only 29 were able to land, 12 of which became stuck, and 2 of which actually sank in the deep water. So by the time the infantry were clambering over the seawall and being pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from the German positions on the coast, they had a full total of 15 tanks supporting them, out of what should have been many, many more. Needless to say, they were unable to capture the German positions with the lack of armour support, and the tanks were really only helpful in helping them retreat, which they soon had to do. Now, all of these tank crews were actually either captured or killed during this raid, as were many of the soldiers. This being the last episode in really the complete failure of Operation Jubilee, apart from the attack on Orange Beach, which had really been a rather minor part of the plan, and was the only part of the plan that had actually gone to plan. So with all of these failures that occurred, what kind of casualties are we talking about? Well, the Allied casualties were really quite bad. Of a force of 10,000 men that had come, 907 Canadians were killed. 1,946 of them were captured by the Germans. 725 of the British were killed, as well as losing a total of 101 aircraft and 1 destroyer being sunk. Of course, out of a massive force, this was not what they were hoping for. The objective had not been captured, and they had essentially proved how not to carry out an amphibious landing. The Germans, in contrast, lost 311 killed, 48 aircraft destroyed, and 1 submarine sank. So where did it all go so wrong? Well, from the get-go really, there were rumours that the Germans knew that they were coming. There had been lots of clues that obviously they were very paranoid about spies being in the war cabinet and knowing about what the plans of the Allies were, and this certainly seems to have been the case with the Dieppe landings. For example, the Canadian government said they seem to have had ample warning of the raid and have made thorough preparations for dealing with it, and there were even officers who claimed that while they landed, there were marking pads drawn onto the sand so that the machine gunners knew exactly where the Allies would be landing, and they also said that the machine gunners were able to find the landing craft and the positions with incredible accuracy and ease, suggesting that they knew something was going to happen. And indeed, French locals and members of the resistance did actually tell the British afterwards that actually machine gunners for the German side had been brought in just before the landings took place, as if they knew that they would be attacking at that location and that they would need more machine gunners, which were ultimately very, very dangerous to the Allies climbing up and were a key part in the German victory over the Dieppe landings of 1942. Even weirder, in the Daily Telegraph, there was actually a clue 6 down French port, and the answer was Dieppe, just before the day before that they did these landings, which caused a massive investigation, because how on earth could this have just been a coincidence? Was this a spy working for the Daily Telegraph, then giving a clue to the Germans that they were attacking Dieppe? Interestingly enough, the day before the landings at D-Day, which were codenamed Operation Overlord, there was from the same guy from the Daily Telegraph a clue, a crossword puzzle, and again they had Overlord as one of the words. So of course you must be thinking, this has to be a spy, what's going on here? You can't just have two incredible coincidences like this. However, there was actually an answer that the spy service found, and this was that he spent time and asked for words from many of the children, who these children were hanging around the American garrisons, the American barracks. So it's very likely that they came up with these words that they heard the adults around them saying, and that because they were the soldiers, they would be discussing obviously these secret plans, and that might be why they had these words like Overlord and Dieppe, because they were planning to go and land in these bases, which is an interesting little point I thought I'd include there. Now as well, the reconnaissance on the German positions was incredibly poor. Actually, aerial reconnaissance hadn't noted the amount of bunkers and machine gun emplacements while they were flying over, and really there wasn't enough information for the Allies, especially what the gradient of the sand was. Many of the Churchill tanks became stuck because it was soft shingle sand rather than harder terrain for them to move up on, as well as the fact that it was such a steep incline that the infantry had a hard time getting up, especially when the German machine gunners were pinning them down with very accurate fire from these bunkers that had been failed to be picked up. Now as well as this, they actually refused to really bombard the town as well as these defences very severely or thoroughly at all, and part of the reason for this was because they wanted to avoid civilian casualties, which may seem like a noble thing, but in war sometimes one must do what one has to do. And really the deeper underlying cause for this was because they didn't want to annoy the Vichy French government, because this was just before the start of Operation Torch, which were the Allied landings in North Africa, and of course this was to liberate or retake the French possessions in North Africa like Algeria, which had been their colonies from the German occupation there. As well as this, the Churchill tanks really were found to be inferior. When the Germans looked at them, they found that really the gun wasn't particularly good, nor was the armour, and they definitely weren't well suited to helping such an assault get off the ground. Lots of them being stuck, some of them sinking. They really weren't what was required of the army to land in such an amphibious attack that they did there. Now, there is also another idea, which was that this attack was actually a cover, that it wasn't meant to succeed, which actually is quite sinister. And one of the reasons they think this is because this was actually a cover, and we know this to be true, to really host an attack on a radio station, which was at Pourville. The reason being they wanted to see how much intelligence the Germans had and how sophisticated their radar systems were. And so they actually had another commando unit going up there, and they were able to cut through the radio lines, disabling that and finding out lots of information, so that the British code crackers and things like this over in England were able to decipher parts of the German code, and they were able to really tap into these radio transmissions that the Germans had, which would prove to be very useful as the war went on. Another, actually, which is incredibly interesting and is related to the guy who wrote the James Bond novels, Ian Fleming, is that this was actually really a raid so that commandos could go into Dieppe under cover of this attack and grab some of the codes for the Enigma machine. Now, the Enigma was essentially this German code that they had in a machine that you could then tap into and write messages to other German commanders. However, for the enemy to get it, they had to have the code for what it was, but that code would change every day. So it was incredibly hard to crack, and that's actually where the first computers come from, is this story of the guy who developed those computers was to keep up with the Enigma so that it could change every day and work it out every day what this Enigma code was that the Germans were using. But at this stage, 1942, they hadn't cracked it yet. So part of the idea was that they would send in these commandos to get these sheets so they could work out how to crack the Enigma code, what it was. And this they ultimately did later on. So what were some of the lessons that they learned? Well, one was always collect proper intelligence on enemy fortifications. Now at Dieppe, they clearly did not do this. You saw the pictures of the seawall with all the Canadian dead, and the bunkers that are literally in a perfect enfilade position to just rain fire down onto them. There was no cover on the beach whatsoever, and they had no idea of the amount of German troops that were there defending those positions. A second rule they learned was the importance of artillery support and the need for aerial bombardment before an attack. These positions were completely intact, whereas at D-Day they bombed the living daylights out of the Norman beaches just before the attack was to commence, so that they did as much damage as possible to the enemy before they sent their infantry up, rather than just sending them up and hoping for the best, as they essentially did at the Dieppe landings. A third rule they learned was the risk of attacking a properly fortified coastal town like Dieppe. Now, during the Normandy landings, they didn't select a specific town to attack, they just attacked the beaches, which were less well defended than the towns. Obviously, towns are much more strategically important, and Dieppe was very well defended indeed, something that they overlooked. So this really, thanks to the lessons that they learned at Dieppe and what not to do, they really were able to then go on, and by the time of June 1944, they had really taken these lessons to heart and used all of it to a much better extent to gain success on D-Day and in Operation Overlord, which then led to the end of the Second World War in Europe and the liberation of the European countries from Nazi rule. And the Dieppe landings, although not very well known and really an ultimate military failure for the Allies, especially the Commonwealth, they were essential to learning the lessons that the Allies needed so that possibly hundreds of thousands of men didn't have to die needlessly later on during D-Day. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you have really enjoyed this video, which was about the Dieppe landings, really the first D-Day that failed. So if you are interested in this kind of thing, I don't talk too much about the Second World War on my channel, History with Hilbert, although I talk about lots of different things, lots of different history, from the Vikings to the 17th century Dutch to the Anglo-Zulu wars and God knows what else. So do give it a check out. Definitely subscribe to this channel for lots more alternate history as well as history content. It's going to be a lot of fun. So thank you very much for watching. I have been History with Hilbert, and this has been the alternative D-Day, the Dieppe landings. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope to see you all again very soon, and don't forget to check in for more of the Alternate History channel.